The Lost Caverns of Ixalan introduces a ton of brand new commanders to the game, but I think one of the most interesting ones from the set is Tetzin, Gnome Champion. While technically a Lost Caverns of Ixalan commander card only found in set and collector boosters, this is a 3-cost blue, red, and white legendary artifact creature Gnome 2/2 that says whenever it or another double-faced artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you mill 3 cards. Then you can put an artifact card from among them into your hand. But it also has the ability for 4 mana to craft with 6 other artifacts, and it turns into the Golden Gear Colossus, a 6/6 legendary artifact creature with vigilance and trample, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you transform up to 1 other target double-faced artifact you control, then create 2 1/1 gnome artifact creature tokens. This card is really cool, caring about a group of cards that we don't have a ton of commanders that care about. It cares all about double-faced artifacts, but what exactly is a double-faced card in Magic terms? Well, there are 3 kinds. There are traditional double-faced cards. These are cards that enter the battlefield on one face and then have some sort of condition that flips them over to the other side. These are double-faced and work with both the front and the back ability of Tetzin, triggering both the mill and the ability to force transform the card. Next up are modal double-faced cards. These are cards that have 2 different faces, but you can cast either side from your hand. This will trigger Tetzin's ability on the front if the front side is an artifact, but will not be able to be transformed by the back ability since the cards don't transform, they just enter on one side or the other. There is currently only 1 modal double-faced card that's an artifact on the front side, and it is not in Tetzin's colors, so you cannot run any modal double-faced cards that are really going to do anything with the deck. The last type are meld cards. These are cards that enter the battlefield on the front and then have some condition where they meld with another card to form 1 mega creature or mega planeswalker on the back. These will trigger Tetzin's front mill ability if they are an artifact on their front, and they cannot be transformed by the back ability. Quick little side note, the color of the card on the back actually does not impact the color identity of meld cards, so cards like Phyrexian Dragon Engine, which only have red on the front, can still be run in the deck despite the fact that it turns into Mishra, which does have black. This deck has a couple different ways it can be built, and I think there's some really interesting things you can do here. The first way is to kind of just build it as a value deck. You're going to put all the double-faced artifacts you can just to kind of play an artifact, then essentially draw a card and fill your graveyard. You then are just going to play a bunch of cards that just care about artifacts and cards that care about your graveyard, maybe recurring some stuff or maybe crafting Tetzin into its backside to create some 1/1s or kill someone with commander damage. There are a lot of great double-faced cards, especially with Lost Caverns of Ixalan introducing a bunch more. We have things like Azur's Gateway, which lets you cycle through your deck and transforms into Sanctum of the Sun, which taps for mana equal to your life total. We also have things like Brass's Tunnel Grinder, which kind of wheels your hand and then turns into a land that gives your spells Discover. We also have cards like Treasure Map, which then turns into Treasure Cove and gives you cards and treasures. Thematic Compass gets you lands into your hand and then turns into a land that removes creatures from combat. Dousing Dagger turns into a land that gives you 3 mana. We have new cards like Mazatlatli, the Great Thor, which has you kind of cycle through your deck as well and then turns into a card that adds mana equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. We have things like Inverted Icebergs, Idol of the Deep King. The point is there's a ton of double-faced cards, and you're going to kind of just put the ones you want in the deck, and then the rest of the cards are going to be taking advantage of the cards in your graveyard, or maybe those double-faced cards and artifacts in general. You know, cards that are typically good in artifact-based decks are going to be good here. Cards like Joyror Weatherlight Captain, which are going to draw you a card every time you cast an artifact or legendary, or cards like Psy Master Thopterus, which are going to make a 1/1 with flying every time you cast an artifact. These are great in the deck because you're going to be casting lots of artifact spells. But there are some really cool cards that take advantage of the graveyard aspect, which I think is a little bit more interesting. Cards like Emery, Lurker of the Loch, is going to get really cheap really fast and will mill you more cards into your graveyard. Then it lets you kind of recast those spells from your graveyard every turn by tapping Emery. You also have cards like Duretti Scrap Savant, which lets you kind of swap cards from your graveyard in the battlefield using that -2 ability, and cards like Wake the Past, which can return every artifact from your graveyard to the battlefield and give them haste, which can be a great way to win the game, kind of resurrecting all of your artifacts all at once for just 7 mana. There's also cards like Scrap Trawler and Mere Retriever, which can kind of repeatedly just recur things from your graveyard to the battlefield and can kind of get you in some fun loops. But I think the big thing is you don't want to be afraid to just play the normal artifact cards. Yes, this says play double-faced artifacts, but if a double-faced artifact is not good and is completely bad, maybe you don't want to run it in the deck. Maybe you'd rather run a card that's just generically good with artifacts. And I think that's the first way this deck is built, is kind of just an artifact value deck that's going to focus a little bit more on the graveyard than your typical Jeskai artifact deck. Another way to build the deck is to care all about that transformability, essentially playing all the double-faced cards with the intention of flipping them upwards without having to meet their requirement to flip upwards. There are a ton of them in Magic's past and a ton more in the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and I think it's a really fun way to build the deck. For example, the Enigma Jewel is a brand new blue card that taps for 2 mana, but you can only spend it to activate abilities, and normally you have to pay 9 mana and craft with 4 or more non-lands with activated abilities in order to transform it, but with this you can kind of just force the transform, turning it into Locus of Enlightenment, which then doubles all of the activated integrated abilities of cards you activate. There's also simpler things like Inverted Iceberg, which is a cantrip on its face, but then you can craft it for 6 mana and another artifact to turn it into a 6/6 that taps or untaps artifacts and creatures when it attacks. Imagine just playing this for 2 and then instantly transforming it with your commander. Seems like a pretty good value. There's also cards like Chalice of Life, which is a 3-cost artifact that you tap to gain a life, and then if you have 10 life more than your starting life total, you transform it and it turns into Chalice of Death, which has you tap to have target player lose 5 life. Instead of having to gain 10 life over potentially 10 turns and having a bunch of other synergies in your deck, you can just transform this with your commander, and now you have an artifact that's beaming someone for 5 every turn. Another interesting thing you can do is you can play the Might Stone and the Weak Stone, which is a 5-cost legendary artifact Power Stone, and as it enters the battlefield, you can either draw 2 cards or give target creature -5/-5 until end of turn. Then you can tap it to add 2 colorless mana, but this mana can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells. Then you can play Urza, Lord Protector, which is a 3-cost Azorius 2/4 that makes artifacts, instants, and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, which is pretty good in a deck all about artifacts. Then if you happen to get both on the battlefield, you can pay 7 to meld them into Urza Planeswalker. This monstrosity of a card is a 7 loyalty Planeswalker that you can activate 2 loyalty abilities a turn. You can +2 and artifacts, instants, and sorcery spells you cast this turn cost 2 less to cast and you gain 2 life. You can +1 to draw 2 cards, then discard a card. You can pay 0 to make 2 1/1 colorless artifact creature tokens. You can -3 to exile target non-land permanent, and you can -10 to make artifacts and planeswalkers you control gain indestructible until end of turn, and then destroy all non-land permanents. All that to say, it's a very powerful planeswalker if you can get it off. Now, the other really interesting thing you can do with this is you can take cards that are double-faced cards that aren't necessarily artifacts and turn them into artifacts with cards like Mycosynth Lattice or Liquimetal Torque. For example, Jin-Gitaxias is a 5-cost blue 5/5 that whenever you cast a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or greater, you draw a card, which is going to be pretty good in the deck. But then if you have 7 or more cards in your hand, you can pay 4 mana to transform it into a Saga. This Saga is really good, allowing you to draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand, and you have no max hand size as long as you control it. It then returns all non-Phyrexian creatures to their owner's hands. You then can cast any number of spells from your hand without paying their mana cost, and then you exile it and return it to the battlefield front face up. This thing's pretty crazy to transform. One thing to note is because you're not exiling it and then returning it to the battlefield transformed, you will not immediately get the first effect of the Saga and will instead have to wait until your next turn to get the first lore counter on it. It's a really weird interaction, but just something to be aware of because these do normally leave and then come back. That also means the Planeswalkers from Magic Origins like Jace Vryn's Prodigy will transform into Planeswalkers that have 0 loyalty and then immediately die since they're being transformed without exiling and coming back. Some other really great cards to transform this way are things like Elish Norn from that same cycle as Jin-Gitaxias, and even Urabrash from that cycle as well. They are all pretty insane sagas that are normally pretty hard to transform. It's also important to note that Incubate tokens work really well with Tetzin, allowing you to transform them into creatures without having to pay mana to turn them up, so those work really great in this deck as well. You also have cards like Search for Iskanta, as well as all of the sagas from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, so there's a bunch of really cool things you can do. You just have to make sure you're running enough cards that turn other cards into artifacts to be running these cards, although a lot of them are good enough to run on their own, and it's just a bonus if you can cheat their transform cost. Either way, Tetzin looks like a really awesome commander that just wants you to play a ton of the normal artifact cards, but then throw in some either double-faced artifacts or just double-faced cards that you can either cheat the transform cost on or just get a ton of value playing them and then kind of replacing them in your hand and filling up your graveyard. I made a deck list that I'm planning on building, and I'm going to put that in the description of this video if you want to check that out. While you're down there, just so you know, this video is sponsored by Wizards of the Coast. If you want to get Tetzin or any of the other awesome cards from the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, check out my link to order something from the set or just learn more about it. Alrighty guys, that is going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this brief commander overview of Tetzin and kind of a cool little way you can build the deck. There's a lot of really awesome cards you can run, and you can see my deck list as kind of an example. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.